Hi, and welcome to our presentation. Our title is Infusing Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies into Foundational Literacy Courses for Pre-Service Teachers. My name is Erin Whitney. I'm here today with Catherine Lemmi and Elizabeth Stevens. We are all faculty at Chico State, and we all teach foundational literacy courses. Next slide. So I want to start with just giving a little bit of theoretical framing and posing the question, why do we need to teach teacher candidates about culturally sustaining practices in foundational literacy courses? And we've always been integrating some of these practices into our coursework, but we feel a real sense of urgency, especially as white women teachers who are working with pre-service candidates in light of the murders of many Black Americans over the, many years, but especially over the summer, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And we feel a real sense of urgency to make sure that our candidates understand Black Lives Matter and understand how to infuse culturally sustaining practices into their pedagogy related to literacy. Next slide. So we want to start out with defining what we're talking about when we say culturally sustaining practices. And this comes from work by Paris and Alim that builds on Ladson Billings and Geneva Gay's work around culturally responsive pedagogy. Paris and Alim say that culturally sustaining requires that our pedagogies be more than responsive or relevant to the cultural experiences and practices of young people. It requires that they support young people in sustaining the cultural and linguistic competence of their communities while simultaneously offering access to dominant cultural competence. Next slide, please. And we also need to clarify what we're talking about when we talk about literacy. We teach foundational literacy, so we teach the skills that teacher candidates need to know in order to teach reading, writing, speaking, listening to their students. But we all frame literacy as sociocultural, multimodal, and agentive, meaning that when young people and adults have the tools of literacy, they can hopefully create change in the world for the better. So that literacy is a function of creating change and engaging with one another in community. Next slide. So in this presentation, we'll be talking about three themes. I'll start out talking about the concept of identity and literacy. And I'll be talking about a Where I'm From poem activity I do with my students. Catherine will be talking about reading pictures and using text in order to interpret and make meaning out of images. And Elizabeth will be talking about how to evaluate literature for cultural competence. Okay, so I'll start out talking about examining literacy and identity. Just a little bit of context, I teach a course in literacy development and assessment. So we focus mainly on acquiring, young children acquiring literacy skills, and we also do some RECA prep, but I also incorporate a lot about identity. Next slide. And I find it really important to clarify this relationship between literacy and identity with my candidates because it's just so crucial. They need to see literacy as social, and they need to see the intersection with identity. Goldie Muhammad, in her recent book, Cultivating Genius, says identity is fluid, multi-layered, and relational, and is shaped by the social and cultural environments as well as by literacy practices. So this means that literacy is not just reading the text on the page, but making sense of who we are in our communities and how we engage in literacy practices. Next slide. So I used some materials from Rethinking Schools to examine this relationship between literacy and identity. Rethinking Schools has just, amazing books, resources, newsletters, and so forth, including the recent Teaching for Black Lives. And then the not quite as recent, but equally useful and important Reading, Writing, and Rising Up by Linda Christensen. And so I use an activity from that book, which actually I used when I was teaching high school a few years ago. And I use it now in my teacher preparation courses as well. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. So I use the Where I'm From poems, which are inspired by George Ella Lyon, that really present a kind of a template, but students really enjoy writing these poems and sharing these poems. And the thing that I find really important about these is that they help students to see the connection between literacy and identity, and how important it is to be able to share their experience through writing and reading one another's poems. So this is just a template. This isn't the whole template, but it's part of a template for how to write the poem. And I have students do this as their introduction to the course in the very beginning of the course. I'll share a poem by a student from one of my asynchronous courses, and we use a Google Currents platform to share work. And so I have students write their poems there to introduce themselves and then make comments to one another to engage in dialogue about their poems. So on the next slide, I'll share a poem by a student in one of my classes who says, "I am from long bike rides around the neighborhood on humid, hot summer days. I am from peach cobbler and vanilla ice cream. I am from dominoes and big laughs. I am from roller skating to Mariah Carey and falling down with friends. I am from video games and popcorn, Cool Ranch Doritos and plays. I am from gumbo and etouffee and family gatherings and lots of love and hugs." So this is just one of many examples of the poems that students write and comment and are able to see a lot of commonalities between one another that really support the idea of literacy being deeply connected to our own identities and our identities within our communities. And so I find it to be an important way to establish that relationship. Next slide. Moving forward, I plan to use some of the materials from the Abolitionist Teaching Network. They demand curriculum that reflects people of color and their contributions, humanity, and joy. And they also pose the question, how will we implement anti-racist curriculum that centers the beauty, joy, and resiliency of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people? And so it's important to me to continue to ask this question and engage my teacher candidates in this question as well. Black Lives Matter at School has multiple resources that I plan to use, including a week of action in the spring, and Bettina Love's book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, is an excellent resource as well for engaging in these ideas. Next slide. And I'll turn it over to Catherine.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a text analysis strategy that I use in my courses. Next slide, please. The context for this lesson is I teach a secondary literacy development course, so I teach single subject credential candidates in all the different subject areas. And we focus in my course a lot on helping our students to develop skills of analyzing and understanding complex texts in our disciplines. So this lesson plan helps us engage in text analysis with a focus on metacognition using a talking to the text strategy. And I've included the high interest images relevant to the Black Lives Matter movement as the complex texts that we analyze in this lesson plan. Next slide, please. So I begin by showing this YouTube video of a teacher modeling the talking to the text strategy using a cartoon. And this helps students understand what we mean when we say metacognition, and helps them understand that an image can be a complex text that needs to be read and interpreted just like a textbook or an article would be as well. Next slide, please. Then we use this talking to the text strategy to analyze this image of Colin Kaepernick kneeling that the students have typically a lot to say about. Some of them have a lot of background knowledge on this and a lot of questions. And so it's really generative for them in terms of their reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And I'll show you some student work samples in just a moment. Next slide, please. This similar image is also included in the Walkie and Bunch Amplifying the Curriculum book. And so this is some student work samples from that book of students who engaged in what they call a silent graffiti activity in a face-to-face class around this image. Next slide, please. And then after the well-known Kaepernick image, we move into the guided reading of a picture that may be less well-known to students. So they're using similar metacognition strategies to talk about another picture. Next slide, please. And this is the image that we use as kind of the foundational complex text of this lesson series. So students are filling out a graphic organizer as they look at this picture and try to interpret what is going on here. So they write down what they see in the picture, what they know about this picture from prior knowledge, and any questions that they may have about this image. Next slide, please. After they do the picture analysis, then they share out in their groups. They listen actively, acknowledge ideas that were already said, and build on or add new ideas. So this round robin strategy allows them to share their ideas, learn from each other, and have a dialogue about the image together. So they're doing reading, writing, and speaking and listening in this series. Next slide, please. So I wanted to share some student work samples from my teacher candidates who engaged in this in a synchronous virtual course this semester. I've done it face-to-face in the past, and I did it virtually this year. And so you can pause the video and read through some of their comments in this image and also in the next one. And then in the next slide, we have student work samples from the 1968 Black Power image. And we had a wide range of background knowledge on this image in my class. So next slide, please. There's another example. Next slide, please. A third example. So finally, next slide, please. I just wanted to wrap up by saying, I've chosen these two images to give students an example of a complex text and help them learn how to analyze a text and what we mean by text analysis and reading. But also, I've chosen them because they're high interest, they're related to social movements, relevant to students, and they really foster a lot of dialogue and motivate students to read and write about what they're seeing. And so they've been really generative for my candidates in terms of that when I've used it. So thank you.
Okay, so hello, my name is Elizabeth. And today I'm going to be presenting on how I teach my pre-service credential students to evaluate multicultural children's literature. So here's a bit of context. The students in my course are on track to earn their multiple and single subject teaching credentials with bilingual authorization. I teach students to evaluate multicultural children's literature in my EDTE 672 course, teaching reading, language arts, and bilingual and/or general education self-contained classrooms. I usually devote one session to this topic at the beginning of the semester after that we've examined other issues of equity and literacy. So to give you an idea of what my goal is for this particular session, I've listed my two primary objectives here. So basically I want students in jigsaw groups, bilingual candidates will be able to evaluate Tiki Tiki Tembo using the 4 criteria to evaluate multicultural children's literature. And then by the end of the session, students will be able to use the same 4 criteria to evaluate the novel that they're currently reading in literature circles. So I chose to use the classic picture book, Tiki Tiki Tembo, as an example in my class because the text is pretty problematic. So it's a common picture book often used in ELA textbooks as a model for folktales and learning about Chinese culture. So the issues are that there's many misrepresentations of Chinese culture that go unnoticed or unquestioned by teachers and students, many stereotypes and, for example, inaccurate language. So to examine this text, I used the 4 criteria for evaluating multicultural children's literature highlighted in Dr. Gopalakrishnan's book, Multicultural Children's Literature, A Critical Issues Approach. And so these 4 criteria are 1, author and illustrator's perspective, 2, multidimensionality, 3, stereotyping, and 4, authentic language. So here is the sequence of my session, which I've aligned with the 5E instructional model. So first I engage students by conducting a shared reading of Tiki Tiki Tembo. After the reading, I ask them their initial thoughts on the text and if they'd want to use this with their students, and if so, how. Next, students are asked to evaluate the book according to Gopalakrishna's 4 criteria, and the students are divided into expert groups, each taking 1 criterion to research via Google. Then they're broken into jigsaw groups where they share findings on all 4 criteria. So when they we then conduct a whole class discussion, sharing our thoughts and reflecting on findings. And then the teacher candidates are then asked to read a blog post titled Rethinking Tiki Tiki Tembo, where the text was actually used in a school setting and it was found to be problematic, and how that school navigated that situation and changed its original plans for the book. So finally, for homework, candidates are asked to evaluate the current novel they're reading in the literature circles in our course using those same 4 criteria. So this is one of my favorite sessions in the course. I think students take away a lot of good information that's new to them. Sometimes the candidates know something is off about Tiki Tiki Tembo, they just can't put their finger on it. So I think teaching them to evaluate texts using these criteria helps to give them that language that match those gut feelings that they have. Some next steps for me is to think about how to weave this act of evaluating the books that we read or use throughout the rest of the semester. So to make it normal practice that becomes second nature to them as future teachers. So there are several assignments where I feel this practice might fit nicely. We have 2 more rounds of literature circles where students read from recently published diverse texts. They also have literature focus unit that they create at the end of the semester. So if you are interested in any of the resources mentioned in the presentation, I provided these titles here along with some great websites to help candidates select quality, authentic, diverse texts. Please feel free to contact me with any questions that you may have at the email listed below. It's also on that first slide. So in conclusion, according to Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, the anti-racist scholar, author, and researcher, to be anti-racist is to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right, inferior or superior with any of the racial groups. Becoming anti-racist requires every individual to choose every day to think, act, and advocate for equality, stressing the need to change systems and policies that have gone unexamined for a long time. So in education, our curriculum really is our policy. So only when we educate our teacher candidates to examine their own policies and practices as future teachers can we truly make any progress in mending the opportunity gap that exists for our communities of color. So if anything, we hope that our presentation today reflects our desire and drive as teacher educators to do our part during this movement for Black lives, cultivating anti-racist educators passionate about culturally sustaining pedagogy by leading through example. Thank you so much.